Lectures Administrator here at the 92nd Street Y. Tonight I welcome you to another installment of our Giants of Science series. With that in mind, I implore you to pick up a copy of our catalog, which schedules the next two events in the series. Our next event here in the Giants of Science is Brian Greene, Wednesday, February 13th at 8 p.m. And James D. Watson, Thursday, February 28th, here at the Y at 8 o'clock. Now, our moderator for tonight is Robert Krulwich. Mr. Krulwich is a special correspondent with ABC News. He appears regularly on Nightline and is a regular moderator here at the 92nd Street Y. His work in the PBS series Frontline has won him an Emmy, George Polk, and DuPont Awards for program on subjects from campaign finance forum to the internet. And now to introduce our special guest for the evening, Robert Krulwich.
Well, before you meet this world-famous two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning, U.S. National Medal of Science winning, Crawford Prize from the Royal Swedish Academy winning, Japan's International Prize for Biology winning, honorary curator of entomology at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology and the Harvard Pellegrino University research professor, major figure in American science, major figure in American letters, blah, 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 blah. I want you to erase all this pedigree, and instead I want you to imagine Ed Wilson at the age of 7, standing in the water up to his knees in the Gulf of Mexico in a place called Paradise Beach, which is just off Pensacola, and you can see Alabama from where he's standing, I think. And I want you to imagine this boy in the summer of 1936 looking into the water, and suddenly, out of nowhere, he sees this huge jellyfish with a cascade of tentacles that are pink and kind of bloody red lines running through it, radiating, he writes later, alien purpose and dark happenings in the kingdom of deep water. This is Ed Wilson's first monster. He doesn't know what it is. All he knows is it's big, and at 7, he says animals were twice as big then as they are now, and he's thrilled. He is repulsed, and he's thrilled. And the only thing he can think of is if he's lucky, really lucky, one day he'll see something even bigger and even more horrible. A child, he writes, comes to the edge of deep water with a mind prepared for wonder. And at age 7, Ed Wilson became a hunter of monsters, an adventurer, an explorer, and that boy never grew up. That boy, he wrote in his amazing autobiography, Naturalist, that boy is still strong inside of me. He is the puppet master of the man. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome 7-year-old Ed Wilson in the body of a 72-year-old world-famous professor. Let's see, for starters, I'm just curious, do you remember the moment when you said the word scientist, comma, I want to be one?
Not scientist, I guess entomologist, you know. I just wanted to work on...
You said entomologist?
Yeah, bugs. Oh, yes. When I was about 8 or 9, I discovered that there were people who actually made their living chasing bugs. You know, every kid has a bug period. I was just set now never to grow out of mine. You were right of what you said. And down in Alabama, we had people who were driving around in green trucks for the Department of Agriculture, and some of them were exterminating insects. And they were made their living by finding and studying bugs. And I said, well, that's what I want to do. Never mind being a fireman or anything like that, I want to do that. So
Kill bugs.
I was frozen in that ambition.
At the age of 7, 5, 6, 7?
8 or 9
8 or 9.
was when I
okay.
really settled down
Now, did science seize you, or did science rescue you? Because you were How many schools did you go to before you were the age of 14 or whatever it was?
Yeah, it was about 13 or 14 schools in 11 grades. I skipped one grade. So that made me always the runt of the class, which didn't help.
So you were the runt
social
kid
skills.
and the new kid every time?
I was always the new kid in the neighborhood, yeah.
So that means what? Now, you have a choice here. You could be the class clown or something, or you could go off into the forest and make friends with a worm or something like that.
Well, yeah, I guess that's a way of looking at it. I turned to nature and the woods and so on, and then I discovered that this eccentricity made me socially acceptable in an odd way. So I had the nickname Bugs when I was in my grammar school thing, but then I had a snake period.
A snake period.
Yeah, and this was in southern Alabama. I guess I was about 15 or 16 by that time, and there were about 40 species of snakes found down there. And in a period of time, about a year, I managed to find them all. I kept a lot of them in the backyard alive, and so I was now known as Snake Wilson. It wasn't because in this intense football culture, I went out for football at this point at Bruton High School in Alabama, and I weighed 112 pounds. I was the second lightest kid.
There are probably a couple of snakes heavier than you.
Wait, let me finish the story. You're a tough competitor.
That's right.
Anyway, so it turned out, you see, there were 23 people on the squad, and I was the entire third string. But at any rate, I got respect in part because I was doing all these strange things, and Alabamians are really, they're really very tolerant of eccentricity. They kind of like it, you know, the odd aunt that lives up in the attic, and you know, that kind of thing. So I got along very well, both as a naturalist, you know, fanatical collector and naturalist at the same, and then in high school too.
And you were a Boy Scout. That was.
Oh yeah. Right.
You actually were a Boy Scout with honors, it says here. You're a Boy Scout with palm clusters. Is that good?
Eagle Scout.
Eagle Scout, sorry. Yes, Eagle Scout.
The Boy Scouts civilized me. That was the thing about it. And they channeled all these energies for outdoors work and study and so on into productive categories. And I've been a staunch supporter of the Boy Scouts ever since, seriously. It's a wonderful organization.
Well, let me see if I can figure out how you came to choose ants. I mean, I know that you saw those trucks go by and murder was in your eyes, but now to study them might be slightly. It's a curious thing. For people who want to go into science, it's just interesting how a great scientist sort of bounces by mistake from one thing to another. Mm-hmm. Can you explain, first of all, if you're going to be a scientist and you want to work in the field, you would presumably want to walk around and see things. Seeing things at a distance would entitle you to go to Africa and I suppose to the Antarctic, and seeing things close up would be a different kind of animal. Let's talk about sight. What happened to your left eye?
Well, it was my right eye.
Oh, nothing happened to your left eye. What happened to your right eye?
Something happened to it. Yeah, I was fishing and I pulled a little fish up that has very sharp fins, and I injured the eye. I got a traumatic cataract and I lost vision. So I only see with the left eye, but I have very sharp vision. So when the time came, as it does for every young, red-blooded American naturalist, to study birds with a Peterson field guide, I had my binoculars and my field guide and so on, and I went out. And I could only see with one eye. I didn't have depth, you know, to see. You gotta have depth to see birds moving back and forth. And I had gotten a little deaf in the upper registers. I think that may be a hereditary thing. And,
so you can't hear like
I couldn't hear the songs and I couldn't see the birds. So,
okay, so we'll cancel birds. You can't do birds.
Yeah, I could do snakes, but but mainly I had this intense interest in insects. I said, that's
well, now when we have insects, you could do butterflies, I suppose, or you could do, you know, a variety of insects.
Oh, I did butterflies, yeah.
I know you did butterflies, but then there's the problem of the Czechoslovakian pins. Can you describe that problem, please?
Yeah. Now, let me explain to the audience, since you're not doing it very well. is that the purpose
This
of
is called leading, or, sort of.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I warned him I would try to end up interviewing him. At any rate, this is all in the way of showing the idiosyncratic and very particular pathways to science and how, maybe I'm stealing your line here.
No, I'm going to
Okay.
sit here mute and admire it.
You can get into science in many ways, and the main thing to have is a passion, for exploring and discovering new things. And you don't have to get in by, doing mathematics and computer science and laboratory experiments from the start and then working your way. And that's one way, but that's not the only way. At any rate, so at the age of 16, I decided that the time had come to get serious about professional entomology. And so I decided to select a group of insects to study. And I said, flies. They're marvelous, tremendous diversity. And so I would start collecting flies. I wanted to become the world expert on flies. But the year was 1945, and in order to study flies, as many of you understand, you have to have insect pins, special pins to put through the body of the specimens.
It'll steal.
Insect pins were available at that time only from Czechoslovakia. And the supply had been cut off in the United States. Insect pins were unavailable. So I said, what's my favorite group of insects? That I don't have to stick pins through, and that's the ants.
Now, how do you preserve an ant if you don't do them with pins? What do you preserve them with?
You can collect them in alcohol.
Alcohol?
Yeah,
that you could get. Alcohol was available in Alabama.
Rubbing alcohol.
Oh, rubbing.
Yeah, I was in this little town in Alabama, so I got started my collection by going down to the drugstore and collecting these little pill bottles. And that with rubbing alcohol, which is isopropyl alcohol, got my collection started. So I built a large collection of ants that I took with me to the University of Alabama.
Could you say that
I was launched?
But for lack of pins and for the availability of rubbing alcohol, therefore ants, or was ants always going to be it, and you would have gotten to it by whatever route?
I think I eventually would have ended up with ants, but I would have been retarded there. I don't think I would have been able to do serious research until maybe I was 18.
Now let's get on to the joy of this may not be obvious to a lot of people, the joy of ant studies, because if you think about it, they do seem like somewhat indifferent to anyone who's observing them and so on. And you might not wonder exactly why somebody would get delight out of looking at ants, but I want to take you back to one moment, which I think is one of my favorites ever. The question is, how do these little ants communicate with one another? The year is 1953, and you're considering the problem. We know that, at least for us, most of our communication goes because of things we hear or things we see. This does not seem to be the habit of ants. So you have some fire ants, and the question is, you notice that a scout will go find a piece of food and somehow tell the other ants, look what I found, come here and get the food. How do you figure out how the scout ant tells the other ants that A, there is food and where it is?
We had the idea, even back then people did, or biologists, that the ants were somehow laying a trail down, and then they were telling the other ants, go out and follow that trail. But nobody knew where the trail came from, and they didn't know really how it worked, and they didn't know how ants communicated otherwise. And you're perfectly right. Human beings are really unusual, along with birds. We are audiovisual, and that puts us in a tiny minority of all of the creatures on Earth, which are primarily chemical in their communication. It wasn't understood or appreciated at that time. Pheromones, many of you have heard the word pheromone. Pheromones are the key to understanding communication of the vast majority of animal species. We didn't know it then. And so one day I set out. I was culturing fire ants then in the laboratory at Harvard. And I said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this And the way I did it was to dissect these tiny, tiny ants. Very difficult to do, but I dissected them.
Now, wait a second. So you're watching the ant going along, and it's laying its abdomen or some part of its body, it's laying it on the ground.
That's right. I can see the ant running along, and under magnification, I can see that it's sticking out its sting and dragging the sting. Something's coming out of that sting.
Kind of like a fountain pen or something?
A little bit like that, yeah. And so I proceed to, believe me, folks, this is the way science goes. I mean, it really is simple-minded. It's only later when you're doing the technical paper, you know, and you're producing the mathematical models and you're describing the microanalysis and so on that it looks tough. It's really, this is the way you're thinking when you're doing science. So I said, I'm going to find out what the organs are inside this ant, and I'm going to track down where that stuff is coming from. So what I did was to do anatomy, and then, just dissected. I knew approximately what the different glands were and so on.
I mean, you snipped off the part where the glands were? You
just dissect open.
Oh, you opened it?
Yeah, an ant, and just the way you would any animal, although it's exceedingly difficult when it's about the size of a grain of salt. That's the tough part. But anyway.
Aren't your hands going,
Well, yes, your hand is vibrating. And in fact, it was down at the limit. I didn't go to a micro manipulator, which is when you're doing it with controls. And I did it raw, manually. But it was right at the limit. So the way I did it was I got these very fine needles in. Because there was this inevitable vibration in your hand, you can see it when you put it in the microscope. Everybody has it. It's a little vibration, but highly magnified. It allowed me to use the needle like a jackhammer.
Like a jackhammer.
I could do it if I did it just right, and just open up the ant that way. Anyway, I took out the various organs one after the other, and I made a preparation, and I made an artificial trail.
Wait a second, make sure I follow this. So you've now got like 6 organs, and you've got the little smushed each one of the 6 organs, and then you're going to take, let me just see if I remember this, you're going to take a sharpened birchwood applicator stick.
Yes, and then I smeared out one organ after another. No effect.
Wait a second. Where are their ants? Are there ants yet? You have brought ants?
I'm leading my artificial trails from the colony that I have in the lab.
Oh, so there are ants over here.
Yeah.
You got your birch stick here, and you're drawing lines of gut stuff, I guess.
It's basically what it is. Yeah, just different organs. I've washed each one in turn and then smeared it out. And finally, I came to a little finger-shaped organ, which we didn't know the function of. It was just a tiny little thing tucked down there, and I smeared that out, and incredible. I didn't have to tell them to follow that trail. They exploded out of the nest running along that thing. And
does that mean like if you take in the stick, could you go doop de doop de doop de doop, and all the ants would go doop de doop de doop de doop?
Yeah. Well, I started playing around with this. It was so effective. For demonstrations, I would write my name. And a column of 100, 200, 300 ants would come pouring out back and forth, and they'd actually write my name in ant. That was the beginning. Just to show that there is some seriousness to this. That was the beginning, and we were able to...
offended ant lover somewhere in the room.
and with the help of chemists, we were right at the threshold at that time of a method called coupled gas chromatography mass spectrometry. We're now in the late 50s. And with chemist colleagues at Harvard, that allows you to identify things down to the millionth of a gram. And we were able then to start doing the chemistry of...
Well, here's what I noticed is in your story about this, you have like a billionth of a gram or a millionth of a gram in each one of these ants. So now you want to figure out like what this stuff is made of, this message stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
So you go down to you take John Law and Chris Walsh with you down to Jacksonville, and you do some version of Noah's flood.
Yeah, you're a careful reader. Anyway,
this is a good tale, I have to tell you.
All right. Okay, so we were dealing with billionths of a gram then, and it's true. Walsh, who then became head of one of the major medical laboratories in Boston, and he was an undergraduate then, and my fellow assistant professor, John Law, became chairman of biochemistry at Chicago. We were in our youth then, and so we went down. We had to get a lot of fire ants, or we felt we did, so that we could get not just a billionth, but we could build this up to at least, say, a thousandth, to get that amount to do the chemical identification. And how would we gather 1 million fire ants? It's not easy.
I wouldn't think.
No, but I remembered something that I had seen when I was a kid, and has since turned out to be a basic behavior of fire ants. Namely, they're adapted to swamps. And when the swamp floods and their nest goes underwater, they come up, they float up, and form a raft.
A living raft.
A living raft, and they get the queen in there and all the young ants, and they float on down until they find dry land.
So you'd have 1 million ants in a little ant-composed raft with the queen on top, or somewhere safe.
Not 1 million, more like 300,000.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So can you
but
scoop,
anyway,
are they
it's a very
scoopable?
substantial mass of ants,
yes.
right? Okay. So what we did was to go down to these little sloughs in northern Florida where fire ants were everywhere, and we dug into the ant mounds and tossed the dirt, ants, everything onto the surface of the water, and the soil soon settled down, and the ants came up and formed their little raft. And then we just scooped the rafts up, and pretty soon we had our 1 million ants.
Now, do the ants take this lying down, or do they?
Oh, no. You know why they call them fire ants?
No.
Well, it's when they sting you, it's a sensation like holding a cigarette or a match too close to the skin. And then after the sting, it frequently develops into a little pustule. And since when you get into a fire ant mound, you could have into the tens of thousands of ants, if you're not careful, swarming on you, each stinging you, it's not easy to handle. So we were very careful about the way we filtered these things.
Did John and Chris ever do this with you again? Did these two guys ever come back with you again to do this thing with the fire ants?
No.
Yeah. All right, now I want to finish this little section because this is my favorite story of all. When you get bad, you get bad. This is, once you begin to figure out how these chemicals and the pheromone and the smells that they give off become communicating devices, you discover that when an ant dies, this doesn't happen to be exactly in that category. When an ant dies, ants not being the smartest creatures around, it just sort of dies and it just sits there, and for the first day or two, all the other ants just don't even notice it. And then when it begins to decompose, it begins to give off a smell, and then the first time it gives off a smell, I guess the next ant that passes by goes, "Whoa!" and says, "We have a dead ant here."
That's right.
And he takes the ant and puts it in the dead place. I guess the ant dead place.
Yeah, I'll tell you about the experiment because I had a lot of fun with it. But let me say that my chemist colleagues and I quickly worked out the chemical code of the ants. We found somewhere, or a good part of it, we found that the ants were communicating somewhere between 10 to 20 chemical signals. They have glands all over their bodies, the function of which were unknown. And many of these glands produce pheromones, some to alarm, some to recruit, some to identify themselves as a member of a caste, and so on.
And one of them says, "I am dead," with the "I am dead"
I'm
smell?
coming to that, yeah.
Okay.
Well, how does an ant, when it dies, how is it identified, as you say? How do the others know? When an ant dies, then for a while it just lies there. If we saw one of us just lying on the ground like this, we'd probably do something. Maybe not in New York, but I mean, but usually we'd do something because we're audio visual. But in the case of the ants,
it's an interesting idea. Is New York most ant-like city in America? Anyway, go ahead.
At any rate, the ant begins to decompose. And I was really going crazy with this. We were so successful. I mean, we were making one discovery after another. It was wonderful. And I was going crazy with this. So I said, how does an ant identify a corpse? It's got to be in the substances that are being produced by decomposition. It's got to be, and in those days, we had just hit upon, animal behaviors generally, had just hit upon the idea of sign stimuli, that animals don't grasp a whole lot of stimuli the way we do, and assess the gestalt in a variety of signals. They usually work out of one substance or a very small number of substances or a site, and then that releases their complex behavior. So I was going to find that what's the corpse substance. It turns out, well, this is how science works across. It turned out that for some reason I never found out, the chemist had already identified a large number of decomposition substances in rotting insects. And so with that as my guide, I gathered in pure form on my laboratory shelf a whole variety of them. The place for a while smelled like a combination between an outhouse and a charnel house. Because there was,
I'll list you some of the smells. You have rotten fish smell, feces
trimethylene.
smell, rancid body smell.
Yeah, that's the fatty acids that you have in body
So when people
odor.
were walking up the corridor in your building, what did they like stay?
I never tried to explain to them, but it was a very strange smelling place. Skate hole was one of the that's the essence of feces.
Yes.
Well, at any rate, I then started with my typical experiments. I started daubing dummy ants with tiny, tiny amounts of these different substances and observing, and nothing happened until finally I came to one of the substances, oleic acid.
Oleic acid.
Yes, a fatty acid of a particular kind. Bingo. The ants then picked it up, and the dummy, with nothing but the only signal they had was oleic acid, and they took it and dropped that dummy on the refuse pile. And so I had it. I essentially had it.
Now here's where you get bad.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Well, you get to play around at this point. So I said, what would happen if I put oleic acid on a live ant? What happens is that nothing this ant says, if they said anything, nothing the ant does any good, because now it is a corpse. And the other ants pick this live kicking ant up, and out it goes, and it's dropped on the refuse pile.
So it's a wiggly, obviously alive ant.
Perfectly healthy.
And the other ant's thinking, you're dead, you're dead,
that's it,
you're
you're
dead,
dead.
all the way to the grave.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
What happened then was that the ant would proceed to clean itself. Ants are always cleaning themselves. And finally, but if it didn't clean itself enough when it got back, it's picked up and brought out. So finally it's clean enough, and then it can re-enter the realm of the living.
You have once sometimes described the process of science as you do it as a form of storytelling. Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think as everyone here understands, that human beings are the storytelling species. The way we think is in narrative. We build scenarios forward, and when we're making a decision, we're running one scenario after another forward. We're telling a story to ourselves. I'm going to do this, that will follow, and so will probably do this, and so on. And I will lose that, or I'll gain this, or I will finish that. And they tell stories of real past, what happened to me. And then, of course, this allows them to make fictional stories. The scientist tells stories, and he hopes they will be true stories. He's thinking, oh, there's this, there's that. This creature is doing this. That creature must be detecting this or have evolved in such a way. And then you make a series of stories. And these are called hypotheses. And the fancy term then for doing science by storytelling is the method of multiple competing hypotheses. And then you do the experiments to find out which of the stories is true.
Are you good at math?
No. I'm not very good at all. I'm ordinary.
Have you tried?
Desperately.
And you've failed, I guess.
I'm literate. but I never was good enough, like so many of my colleagues, at being able to do mathematical modeling. That is, to think in mathematics and think purely in abstraction.
So if you're trying to turn this story or some patterns that you see in the world, or first of all, you're just sort of in love with an animal, then you watch the animal doing whatever it does, and then you begin to sort of notice some patterns. At some point, doesn't it have to, in order to become respectable, doesn't it have to take on some kind of algebra or some kind of...
Oh, yes. And then you get, as happened in the case of pheromone studies, chemical communication of ants, and then I extended this to all animals in a general theory. You have to then build mathematical models, physical models of diffusing molecules and so on. But what I do is to, if I can't do that myself, I collaborate with a mathematician. I either collaborated with a chemist, or you could put it from their point of view, they collaborated with me. I provided the ants and the problem. And similarly, I collaborate with the mathematicians. I've had the good fortune of collaborating with some of the best applied mathematicians in the country, and because they are interested in this as a series of problems. So that's what I did in this case. I worked with a brilliant young mathematician. He was one of my students, Bill Bossert, who's a professor now at Harvard. And together, working with the biology, working with the patterns and so on, we developed a pretty good theory of the origin and the evolution and the form, the design of communication by chemical vapor and trails and liquid surfaces and so on.
So you walk into basically it's a seduction. You come in with a good story to tell, which you're trying to make sense of, and you try to seduce a mathematician into helping you.
Oh, I wouldn't call it seduction. I would say making them an offer they can't refuse. After all, in a way, they have the better part of it, because the phenomenon is worked out, and it's that we're trying to build the story, so to speak, of taking it farther. But this requires special skills and conceptual abilities that I'm not able to take into mathematical terms. And this provides them the opportunity to do that. And it's always been extremely fruitful for me through my career to carry on long sessions of discussion and creative work with a mathematician.
And I'm just curious here about the feeling, like Tom Wolfe writing about you has called you a very, very smart guy. He thinks you're a really, really smart guy. And I guess schools you've passed through seem to think you're a really smart guy because they give you a lot of fellowships, and I'm sure you got good grades. But do you feel like a really smart guy, or do you feel more of the time as a tutor or a tutee?
I suffer from the syndrome of people who've been moderately successful, of thinking that I'm basically a fraud. I don't feel nearly as smart as a lot of people apparently think I am. And, apparently it's very common among people who've been graced with recognition and success, particularly in intellectual fields, that they know how little they know. I've just gone through a big confessional about math inadequacy, and they know that no matter what they do, there are people who are brighter, more creative in this area or that area, and somehow nonetheless you've stumbled on it and you've been lucky, but you don't really feel as though you're really a master of that subject.
So when the prophet Nehemiah comes running into your office, pointing his finger and saying, you're going to be accused of what, sort of piggybacking on somebody else's work, or half-truths, or sloppy homework, or...
Never. I'll tell him I got it right. And I got it myself. It's just that I felt I could have done so much more if I had been brighter and more prescient.
But on the other hand, the company you keep, for a guy who was a little nervous about his smarts, I'm quoting from something I read once. You get into this habit. Here's the people you're doing this with: Murray Gell-Mann and Steve Weinberg. I don't know how many of you guys know who they are, but they are way smart. So You say, when talking to certain friends, I have this habit. I try to match them fact for fact, idea for idea, and I don't like quitting. In fact, I never quit. This is the reason I get killed with Murray Gell-Mann and Steve Weinberg. I end up completely exhausted. I'm thinking, like, why would you do that? Why don't you make friends with somebody like who can't tie his shoes? Then you could feel great.
Well, there's more to our friendship than that, of course.
Okay.
But with those two gentlemen, who are probably our premier theoretical physicists of this generation, who also happen to have photographic memories, especially Murray Gell-Mann. And in Murray's case, how shall I say, enjoys displaying encyclopedic knowledge, then this can get difficult. But on the other hand, in conversations where we have common ground and we're trying to reach some sort of a solution, in Murray Gell-Mann's case, conservation, he's an ardent conservationist, we're extremely compatible.
Well, let me move this conversation towards the book that you've written, which I think is only fair, since that's why you came here. Before I do, let me just take you through one more pattern-finding exercise, which will be relevant. With Robert MacArthur, who is another one of your math cohorts. Are you familiar with George S. Kaufman, the Broadway playwright? Yeah. He did this too. He would go with Edna Ferber and Moss Hart. He'd always find somebody to write his plays with. I don't know why I mentioned that, but anyway. Robert MacArthur and you are thinking over this question. A patch of land perhaps can only or maybe has a natural or an ideal number of creatures or inhabitants. And maybe if you think really hard about it, you could predict how many different creatures would naturally fit into a discrete space. And maybe there would be some number that is about right. So if new creatures come in, they'd have to push out some old ones. This is called dynamic equilibrium. Mm-hmm. But in order to test this thesis, you need to take a place that has some animals and plants in it and just wipe it clean, make a prediction and say, okay, we expect to have 110 back, and then wait and see if you get 110 back. Now, how in the real world do you create, I mean, you could get Krakatoa, I suppose, but that's a little hard to engineer.
No.
How do you get a place that's full and then make it empty and then wait and get it full again? How do you do that?
In the 1960s, Robert MacArthur and I were very ambitious assistant professors. Now we're in a totally different area. One of my main interests was biogeography, the distribution of animals and the study of diversity itself. And MacArthur was a pioneering ecologist, easily the most brilliant ecologist of his generation. And we, in conversations, began to talk about what is the balance of nature? What does it really consist of? I had come back from a tour in the South Pacific. I'd gone from island to island and had thought a lot about how species replace one another and how they may come into balance. We then worked out a general equilibrium theory. I won't go into the details of it, except it's very simple, and gave some meaning to an effect that had been noticed by others, but now we refined it and gave an explanation for it, that as you increase the area, you increase the number of species that that area can sustain, you know, like an island, or it also can be a patch of forest, can sustain indefinitely. And there is a regular quantitative relationship. Without going into the details of the theory, it made a series of predictions about the effective distance of the island from the mainland and how big the island is and so on. And the experiment that you're referring to, that was extremely successful when it came out, the theory. It was widely accepted, and I think it started a whole industry of studies of this nature and theoretical studies, and played an important part in the origin of the new science of conservation biology, because, you know, obviously size matters, you know, the size of the reserve matters. But I wanted to experiment on that. And so with a graduate student of mine, Dan Simberloff, who's now a very distinguished senior ecologist in his own right, we went down to the Florida Keys and picked a miniature system We
You picked a
couldn't-
miniature system?
Clumps of mangrove in Florida Bay, which are islands, to insects. We figured that we couldn't deal with equilibrium studies of birds or mammals and so on, but we could with these miniature creatures, insects, if they were small, and then we could take small islands, maybe, a quarter of an acre in size. And then if we could remove all of those insects in one stroke without harming the vegetation and study what insects were there, how many species were there, and then after we'd removed them all, watch the return, and we could see the rate at which they return and the level to which they return, and we could test the theory of island biogeography. This was the first attempt at experimental zoogeography.
So you're going to take a natural patch of land, a little teeny patch of the earth, of a land of a mangrove tree surrounded by kunjal on the earth, and you're going to just kill everything on it?
Mm-hmm. No. Now, this is an area called the 10,000 Islands. So, we weren't doing great environmental destruction. It was in the government reserve, and we had the full approval of the National Park Service.
But how do you kill everything on a...
There's the nub. How do you do that? Well, to make a long story short, what we did was to hire a professional extermination company. And in the Miami...
Where do you get it? When you call them and say, hi, we want to take you out to a mangrove swamp?
It was almost like that.
This is in Miami. He must have thought
we got a great guy. I just got together with him again recently, and he still can't quite believe what he did. But at any rate, in Miami, there's a lot of pest problems, including termite destruction of buildings. So the exterminators in Miami have a technique of putting a rubberized nylon tent over the entire building. They can do this with a warehouse. And at that time, they pumped in methylene bromide, which kills the insects completely.
So the head of the pesticide company is asked...
Build tents over the islands.
Which he, by the way, I believe he discovers his tent builder who's a roofer or something. He's riding along one day and Ralph Nevins is working on a roof somewhere.
I sent Dan out looking for an exterminator who could do the job. But the point was that they had a very difficult time setting up a conventional scaffolding over an island. It wasn't working very well. And the guy that we contracted, the head of an extermination company in Miami, was very upset and perplexed by this. And one day he was driving and he saw a steeplejack rigging cables up over a tall building. And he waited till he came down, and then he said, could you raise a steeple or a high tower in the middle of a little island in the Florida Keys and rig it so that we could put rubberized tent over that? And the steeplejack said, sure. So that's what we did. And I went out with them for one of these experiments. It was to show you the kind of adventures we had. It was really great. And the first time we went out, there were sharks in the water. They were so-called nurse sharks.
So
and
the exterminators wouldn't get out of their...
No. And everybody knows that nurse sharks will not attack you. They only bite if you try to grab them. So
what do you mean everybody?
Like 6 foot long, cruising around. These guys wouldn't get out. So I did a little bit of fake macho and took an oar and I said, I'll keep the sharks away. I went out and waded up to my waist, and poked at them and kept them out. And I wasn't, in fear of getting bitten or anything. And then they did the job. So it worked. We got the whole experiment done, and we pretty
By the way, was the pattern that you had imagined to be in place, did it in fact take place?
It was amazingly precise. The number of species that were on each island, they differed according to the distance of the island. That's one of the parameters that we were working with. We had that set. We measured that before we began and identified all the species. And when it returned to equilibrium, you could tell, it goes up and then it levels off. For each island, it was the same as before, the pattern. So we had demonstrated equilibrium.
When you come up with a theory, and a guess about how the real world works, and then you put it to a test. When the test is successful and it produces the results that you predicted, do you feel relief, astonishment, or no feelings at all but numbness?
Well, I think relieved is the word, because you've had the thrill of conceiving it, you had the thrill of getting a successful experiment, and if it works, then there's a sense of relief.
But there's no sense of surprise that you, after all, you guessed right.
That depends on how good your theory is.
All right, let's get to this new pattern that you've observed about our planet, which is the subject of the new book. You believe, I'll quote you here, that in the natural world in the year 2001 is everywhere disappearing before our eyes, cut to pieces, mowed down, plowed under, replaced by human artifacts. You appear to think, from what you can see, that human beings who have been multiplying rapidly, and the friends of human beings, pigs, rats, ants, I don't know, our fellow travelers, the sort of weedy types that go everywhere. We are pushing all of the other creatures on Earth closer and closer into trouble, or at least crowding out the planet. Do you think we are in the middle of some significantly different level of extinction than, say, the past 1.5 million years?
Well, I believe it. I'm pretty sure of it, and so does virtually every scientist in the world who works on biological diversity and field studies.
To be more precise, have you any notion of how bad it is?
Yeah. We reckon by a couple of methods, which include this equilibrium principle and working it out empirically in the field. And then another method has been used is to track the velocity of species as they go from safe, individual species, safe to the vulnerable category in the red data list where we keep track of species status, and how fast they are going from safe to vulnerable to endangered to critically endangered to extinct. So we can track and we can estimate the rate at which species are traveling to extinction. And that's an independent method from measuring how fast the habitats are being eliminated and then translating that into how much species loss will be by this contraction. And the answer is to order of magnitude 0.1%, about 1 in 1,000 per year. That order of magnitude could be up much, higher.
Let me ask it in a normal way. Of all of the plants, animals, and creatures, the living creatures on Earth, how many of them won't be here in 2030?
Well, everything, of course, depends on whether the current environmental degradation.
Assuming the same rate of environmental pressure.
But I believe, now I'm in the realm of belief, because, we're now making plausible stories, that if present conditions continue, habitat destruction, the rising flood of alien species that are spreading around the world and pushing other species out, pollution, and over-harvesting, those are the big killers, with the root cause of human overpopulation pushing them, driving all that. At present, if that's left unabated, due to the acceleration of the effects that this is causing, we could lose half the species of plants and animals on Earth by the end of the century.
Half of everything.
Half of everything.
Extinctions, just to fill me in here, extinctions are ordinary. If we were to take what you refer to in your book as the Edenic, or the Garden of Eden, sort of the good times, how many extinctions do you get every 1 million years? How many species pop off?
Well, the fossil record shows that before human beings came along, it was about one species going extinct per million per year.
And how many new guys come out?
About the same.
It's the same plus, isn't it? It's one goes and one and a bit comes.
Right, statistically. The
but in
turnover
fact,
was about that slow through time before humanity came.
One out, one in. Although it's one out and one in and a bit, because we now have about twice as many species as we did 400 million years ago, right, or something like that.
Yeah, that's over a long period of time. There's been this gradual drift up, almost imperceptibly larger amount of birth than death.
So, by your reckoning, since you gave us that drastic prediction just now, right now, instead of losing one creature every million years, what's the rate now?
Well, it's instead of 1 per million per year, it's about on the order of magnitude of 1,000 per million per year. That's the 0.1% figure.
Well, now,
or,
if this is...
or more. In an earlier work I did very conservative estimates based on the rate at which tropical rainforests are disappearing, and more than half the species of plants and animals are probably in the tropical rainforest. The rate at which the tropical rainforests are being cut yields, even with highly conservative values put on these models, about 0.25%, being extinguished or doomed to early extinction.
There's a bit of math I'd like to get to here. The underlying these calculations is one piece of work that you guys have done. I think it was you, or maybe Ernst Mayr or somebody. It was this formula. If you have a space, if you have a forest, let's say, and you mow down 90% of the forest,
Yeah.
by your reckoning, what percentage of the creatures in that forest go extinct? 90% of the forest down.
They go extinct immediately or prematurely at an early stage, about half.
Half. So that, like the Titanic, everybody goes to the last 10%.
That's true. That's the thing.
Sad for them, but
we should bear. That's true. Well, that's something we should bear in mind. If you eliminate 90% of a forest, then you're probably going to lose somewhere in the vicinity of 50% of the species rather soon. But all you need to do then, you got 10% left, is just take the other 10% out. And a good crew, sometimes for part of a forest with a bulldozer, can do that in no time at all. Then you go from 50% to 0 or close to it.
So everything dies. Then if you get rid of 100% of the habitat, you lose 100% of the creatures.
Yeah, this is why I speak of the accelerating rate, because so much of the forests of the world have been chopped into little fragments, and we can now still measure it as half or a little less than the forest covers left. But that is, in many cases, broken up into fragments. And those fragments can be taken out very easily, and in fact are being taken out.
Okay, Professor E.O. Wilson, you probably have heard of a young Danish statistician named Bjorn Lundberg, who has a best-selling book out now, and he asks you, actually pointedly asks you, this question. He says, if you're right about this, explain to me this phenomenon. Here in North America, in 1492, there was a very thick virgin forest that covered, let's just choose a chunk, from the Atlantic Ocean to lots and lots and lots of trees. And between 1492 and, say, 1910, almost all of those trees got knocked down. A arboreal holocaust, if you will, a tremendous destruction of the habitat. Mr. Lomborg, I think his technique was he went to some dictionary or book somewhere and found out that there was an anecdotal record of, let's just choose birds, of birds that used to live in America in the 1500s and early 1600s. People would mention them. So he made a list of all the birds that were mentioned in the 1600s. And then he made a list of all the birds that were in America in 1960. Now, if you were right about destroying the habitat, Mr. Lundberg should have found an awful lot of missing birds. Probably at least 50% of the birds should be missing. He found nothing of the kind. He found, I think, on average, he found something less than 1% of the birds missing. If you're right about your theory, how do you explain Mr. Lundberg's observations about North America?
Sloppy scholarship. To start with, he didn't need to dig that information out. It was already in the literature.
Well, to be fair, he found it.
Well, that's true. He evidently did not read the rest of the literature, because we know that situation very precisely. and it is as follows. We're down to 1% approximately of the original virgin forest. But forest regrew rapidly whenever it was cut through eastern North America. And even at the time of the severest cutting of forest in the 19th century, it never got below 40%. If you take the figure of 40% of area and translate it into the number of species that should go extinct of those species of birds that are limited to the forest of the east of North America, using the figure for the area-species relation that is typical and median for this, you come up with a prediction of five species should have gone extinct. Number of species that went extinct, 5. When you go to Puerto Rico, a similar...
Wait a second, let me stop you before you go to Puerto Rico.
Oh,
so
okay,
you're
fine.
saying that the forest really didn't get destroyed, but the forest was at least that forest that got destroyed, that Paul Bunyan knocked down, and then
Mr. Lomberg confused virgin forest with other normal forest.
and the fact that the virgin forest went and then was replaced by what we call the post-virgin forest didn't affect the bird population. They could live in either tree, the first tree or the...
The species that could live in regenerating forests, you see it was continuously regenerating through most of American history, were able to survive in the quite good growth that came back in.
Okay.
One exception...
So you're saying your theory still stands and his evidence, he doesn't cast a doubt in your mind.
Actually, the prediction came out almost embarrassingly close. And this is based on work which Mr. Lomberg apparently was unaware of by Stuart Pym of Columbia University.
Okay, we could go to Puerto Rico. I don't know. I'm afraid if I go to Puerto Rico...
Let's put it this way. Other examples cited by Mr. Lomberg it makes one wish that he had done his work more carefully and also had passed that chapter by one of the people actually doing the research. Apparently he did not.
Let's try some other version of good news, because actually Bjorn Lomberg, if he were right, would be pretty good news. We'd have an awful lot more time to work things out. But you have in your book actually certainly a sort of an optimistic cast, actually. First of all, you describe the moment that we're in right now as a bottleneck moment. What does that mean?
I think it's useful to think of humanity right now as a kind of bottleneck of overpopulation and rising per capita consumption. And the reason I call it a bottleneck, because that implies, that there's an opening out at the end, is that at the present time, we're at a little over 6 billion. The best United Nations...
I mean, there's 6 billion human beings.
Yeah, people. And the best projections, those of the United Nations Population Bureau, have us very likely going to about 8 to 9 billion before we peak, if present trends continue. And that also includes the presumption that the fertility rate of women will continue to decline at least as fast as it has been in the past. Okay, so we'll go to 8 to 9. It is 9 to 10. 9 to 10 billion, most likely, by the end of the century, and then it'll come over, and if trends continue, the population will start to drop. So that's part of getting out of the bottleneck.
Hold on a second. So you're thinking that Mrs. Earthling will have decided that rather than have 8 babies or 7 babies or 6 babies or 5 babies or 4 babies or 3 babies or 2.1 babies, Mrs. Earthling on average will choose to meet Mr. Earthling, and they will produce less than 2.1 babies per couple everywhere on Earth on average.
Actually, that's happening. It turns out, and it's a blessing of human nature, I would call it, virtually an instinct, which we haven't appreciated. It's providential. Women generally around the world, when they became better educated, liberated, and more secure, they could have gone the opposite way. They then could have seized upon this to have even larger families. But the opposite is the case everywhere.
It comes with education, income increase, health increase.
They choose fewer children. It's what we call K selection. That is, they go from R selection to K selection. That is, In case selection, you opt for, whether you do it consciously or whether you do it as an instinct, as in animals, you go for a smaller number of high-quality children. That's true. It's a Darwinian...
Sort of the Garrison Keillor approach, where all of your children are above average.
Darwinian superior strategy.
Wait a second, does the math then work in the virtual cycle? If you go from an Earth with 3 million to an Earth with 3 billion to 10 billion, do you then go from Earth with 10 billion back down to, but once you get below 2, you can start to shrink, and then shrink, then Mr. and Mrs. Earthling have fewer than Mr. and Mrs. Earthling, and they have fewer, and they have fewer, and you could go down pretty fast.
Yeah, there may come a time in the 22nd century when people will be encouraged to have larger families, but heaven forbid that that's done now. We've got to get through this bottleneck. You see, at the same time, per capita consumption and production is rising. That means that there's a good chance that people around the world will get to a decent standard of living, and we can have these lower fertility rates kicking in the developing world as well. But the problem is, and it's the other part of the bottleneck, is that even if humanity gets through this way, while we're doing it with consuming more and more people consuming per capita, we are in the process of pushing the last remnants of the natural environment out of existence in order to make, more food, more product. So somehow we have to figure out how to get humanity through to everyone has a decent standard of living, population rates, growth rates are dropping, and we've carried through as much of the rest of life as possible. I think that's what the 21st century is going to be all about.
So you think that this is a kind of a rather important historical moment, obviously, and the bottleneck you think will last at least, let's say it's the 100-year bottleneck, roughly?
Very roughly.
So here is your solutions for the 100 years. During these 100 years, you would like us to protect hotspots. There are apparently 25 places on Earth that you've identified where there are tremendous concentrations of plants and animals altogether. You want to
endangered animals.
Endangered.
So you save those, you save a large percentage of species that are at some risk.
So protect the hotspots. Protect the last great 5 forests. Read the book to find out where they are. Clean the rivers. Describe and catalog everybody who's here, so we have a list, so we know where we are. Come up with economic incentives to keep wild places wild, and so the neighbors don't, poach. And then set aside wildlands. Now, this, to me, is the headline of your book, I think. How much of this planet should we set aside, you ask yourself? And you answer, quote, at the risk of being called an extremist, which on this topic I freely admit I am, let me suggest 50%. Half the world for humanity, half the world for the rest of life.
Yes, that is the goal. We couldn't
dream on, I think.
We couldn't do it now, but this is something to go for, because allowing the natural world to regenerate to that extent, then the Earth would become a paradise. Because bear in mind that not only would we then safely share the world with the rest of life safely, but the rest of life, the ecosystems sustain us at no cost in providing stability and the services we need. Several years ago, a group of biologists and economists made an estimate of how much right now these natural ecosystems, the forest, the shallow seas, so on, are providing humanity in services, stabilizing our atmosphere, giving us pure water, restoring soil, on and on. And they came up with a figure of $33 trillion, which is substantially more than the gross world product. And all of that is free. As we eliminate more and more of the natural ecosystems, we're having to shift to the prosthetic devices. That is, toward new devices to perform those services. Not too long ago, the people of New York, for example, had a choice. They could either save the Catskills, the natural environment of the Catskills, their watershed, by conservation methods, keeping it entire and continue to get their fresh water nearly free, or they could allow the Catskills to go ahead and be polluted and cut over and build a filtration plant. And the difference, can't remember the exact figures, but the difference in cost was staggering. And furthermore, by maintaining the Catskills, you have a permanent solution.
But I think I should probably get close to concluding so you can ask questions and so we can go home. I got a little carried away. When we started this at 8, when did we start this? Oh, gee, I'm sorry. Well,
15.
you know, it's rare to get somebody like this, so. You guys can ask, and in this case, I think, here's the deal. For those of you who have to do something like babysitters or whatever, as soon as I ask this last question, then those people who have to go can go, and then the questioners can stay until they throw us out. So here's my last question. This is, just as we test your optimistic, if you're going to come in as an optimist here, what makes you think that, well, I'll quote you, once you were asked whether humanity is suicidal, you did admit that people place themselves first, their own personal interest first, the interest of their families second, the interest of the tribe third, and the rest of the world, you put it, a distant fourth. And that this notion comes down sort of kind of embedded in us because we lived for a while where that was a pretty good formula for the first million years of our species. What makes you think that arguments like it's efficient or it pays better will win over some deep, deep selfish instinct to propagate, take care of one's own, and forget everybody else? This is not a forget the everybody else plan that you're proposing.
The other providential human trait, which is reason and the ability to see into the future. And when we began to build those scenarios we were talking about, beyond the next annual budget, beyond the war we're in at the present time, beyond our forecast for food production in the next 10 years and so on, and we begin to look a little farther into the future, then we see that behavior, which is very adaptable right now, becomes dangerously maladaptive if extended farther beyond. And that's emphatically the case in our treatment of the natural environment. So one doesn't have to go through some kind of miracle of altruism, expect people, to do things for future generations that harm themselves and are working against their self-interest. This is in their self-interest. And it just requires...
Palpably or arguably? Palpably or arguably?
I think that with growing knowledge, it becomes palpable. The more we know, as for example, the more exact we're getting global warming, the more exact we're getting figures of deforestation and species extinction, then it becomes palpable. And we realize that we're not talking about things that are going to go wrong in the 23rd century. We're talking about things that are beginning to go wrong now and will become evident, in some cases severe, within 20 or 30 years.
Okay, now for those of you who want to leave, this is the time. For those of you who want to stay, we'll take a 30-second break and then we'll ask questions. I think the way we'll do the question part is, since it's not a big room, those people who have questions can simply raise their hands and we'll do it that way. So why don't we, yes, third row in the red. Just stand up, I guess, and I'll repeat the question so people can hear it.
I'm straying from conservation to something that you have written before. In an article in Nightline, I think, you described yourself as, you say, as far as religion is concerned, you lean towards deism, but consider its proof largely a problem in astrophysics. Could you, in 2 minutes, elaborate a little on
The question is, this lady is reading from something she found that he wrote, and the question of God came up, or deism came up, and she quotes Ed as saying something to the effect that he believes, what was the phrase?
He would call himself a deist.
He would call himself a deist,
But he would look for
proof in astrophysics. Explain.
Oh, yes. Well, let me say, first of all, that I'm not embarrassed to state plainly what my metaphysical beliefs are. I'm also not fearful of saying I could be wrong about all of this. When asked what my beliefs, particularly about the deity or design in the universe are, I say that I'm not an agnostic. I don't believe that the truth is unknowable. I think it may eventually become knowable to us in ways that we don't know yet or foresee. I'm not an atheist because I think it would be foolish to deny something that you don't really know yet, particularly about the origin of the universe and of the physical parameters that guided the evolution of the physical environment, physical world. But one thing I do feel increasingly strongly about is that there is not a personal God. There's not a God. There's not divine guidance over humanity or over individuals. That we were created by design through evolution. I think all of the evidence is overwhelming that we were created by a process of natural selection. And the more biology matures, the more firm that conclusion seems to get. And so that is pretty much the worldview I have right now.
Do you feel, as a formerly religious person, because you did receive communion, or I remember when you were a little kid.
Oh, no, First Baptist. I went under the water.
First Baptist. All right, so
okay.
But do you feel at all a little lonely in your current? Do you say what you just said with any overlay of emotion? Was it with strength? With
I'd like to refer to what we do share, regardless of our particular metaphysics. And incidentally, when I spoke of astrophysics, I said whether or not we can discern a purpose, may turn out to be a problem in astrophysics. If it's going to be hunted down, it's going to be hunted within that discipline at that level. It's pretty well, it's not going to be found in evolutionary biology or biology generally, because the search for it or the signs of it just simply haven't appeared. But the thing we share, I believe, apart from the metaphysics, is spirituality. And that's a word I believe maybe we should cultivate more. That's what an evangelical Christian shares with a secular humanist. Both feel a deep sense of spirituality in living on this planet, in a human society, and in witnessing the almost incomprehensibly vast wonders of the living world. And it's that spirituality that has made me such an ardent conservation. Partly it was made me such an ardent conservation. And I think I want to preserve the temple.
The question is, she's empathetic with your general worldview, but is cautious because she thinks it's very, very hard to predict the future. You certainly you can't be aware of technological breakthroughs or just very, very surprising changes that will change your numbers, whether it's AIDS, I suppose, eliminating people, or new machines that would leverage our abilities in some mysterious and unknown way. So the bottom line question was, could you be erring on a Malthusian side? In other words, could you be too pessimistic about human propagation?
I don't think I'm too pessimistic because, for example, to keep it just under 8 billion would require all the women in the world to drop to below replacement rate by the year 2000. That's the average of 2 children per woman. And it's we know we're not going to do that. And so I'm not being too pessimistic, but I might be too optimistic. I mean, the United Nations projection of say, up to 9 or 10 billion could be an underestimate. It's admittedly, no one knows. You can make these projections on the basis of present trends, but they could change, and it's a crapshoot.
You do know that there's Julian Simon recently of University of Maryland and other very optimistic people say, look, we're not like all the other creatures on Earth. We have our reason, as you just pointed out, and for every new billion of us, there's a couple of Einsteins and a couple of Wilsons and a couple of others, and that they'll make us elevators, that will make us buildings that are higher than we ever imagined. They'll get us rocket ships. They'll create all kinds of things, and therefore we can count on good news if there are more of us. So, rah for the next billion.
Yeah. That's what's known as the cornucopian or exemptionalist view, namely that no matter how bad the projections look, no matter how much trouble we're about to get into, human ingenuity will find a way to get us out. But I remember that Julian Simon, and I think this was repeated by Bjorn Lomborg, argued that there's no reason to doubt that humanity could continue its present rate of growth for another billion years. Well, I think you can show mathematically that even at a relatively low rate of exponential growth that we're at now, it would, by a couple thousand years, humanity would weigh about equal to the Earth.
But I take it even more than that. You have a profound difference with Julian Simon and his ilk, that you think that we are really inextricably tied to the other creatures and the biosphere that we live in, and he wasn't so sure about that.
Yeah, I like to define environmentalism in a different way. What is environmentalism? It's not an irritating lobby that upper middle class Caucasians enjoy in Washington, or pursue in Washington. Environmentalism is a concern of everybody down to the last mud hut in Paraguay. Environmentalism is the perception that humanity is a biological species living in a biological world, a species that has been exquisitely adapted by millions of years of evolution to this particular planet, and not just to this planet, but to this razor-thin biosphere film that surrounds the planet, that creates a peculiar disequilibrium. We are not in physical equilibrium. That is, the world's surface is not in physical equilibrium. It's in disequilibrium maintained by those millions of species of organisms. And if we disturb them too much, then we're going to shift to another equilibrium or start all the way down to that original uninhabitable physical equilibrium. So it's the sense that we must somehow maintain the biosphere, our cradle, the cradle of human evolution to which our physiology and our minds are beautifully adapted in order to ensure a healthy future for the human species. That is environmentalism.
I would appreciate your comment on following up on this young lady's point. There was a famous study, I believe somewhere around 1870, 1880 in New York, in which a city planner was asked to take a look at horses in the street, and he came up with a study that said something to the effect that by 1935 there'll be so much horse manure in the street, it'll be 10 feet tall and nobody will be able to get around.
That's right.
So I appreciate your comment with that type of projection.
Everybody hear the horse manure analogy? No. Once upon a time, some smart man in New York about 1870s, just extrapolating from the number of horses pooping that he saw, imagined more people, therefore more horses, therefore more poop, and said you can't have the city bigger than X because there'd be too much poop in town and you couldn't have a city that way anymore. But he was wrong. He was wrong.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not sure what the question is, but wasn't he?
He was wrong. We're getting a little more sophisticated at making projections now than was done by. I mean, 1,000 scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, for example, working with supercomputers and really examining climate change in minute detail may prove wrong in the end, but they're much less likely than to do so than someone measuring horse manure in 1870.
Right, we'll have 10 more minutes. 10 more minutes before we clear out of here, I think. Is that okay? 5? 5?
5 what?
5. Yeah.
And as the world's most preeminent disseminator and defender of the theory of evolution in your popular works, are you distressed by the persistence of creationism in this country? Can you understand it? And if so, can you explain it to us?
Everybody hear the question?
No. Well, yes, in a way, in that, and it's summed up by something Bertrand Russell said, that people would rather die than learn arithmetic. Another thing he said was, people would rather believe than know. There's something so comforting about an absolute system of belief shared by the tribe, the community to which you belong, the community that shelters you, and to which you fully participate, and from which you draw your security. And this tribe has a ethos and it has a mythos, and it's very simply put in concrete terms. You're safe there. You're comfortable. It's just a trait of human nature to want to live in a cocooned intellectual existence like that. Evolution is a very disturbing concept. And it leads to a transcendentalist, to an empiricist view of the world, of the real world, as opposed to a transcendentalist. And it's a difficult wrench. And I can understand how this could be continued, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary of some of the dogmas.
Wait a second. Weren't you the guy who 5 minutes ago said that the arguments that you were making would become palpable? Now, he's suggesting to you that you could have to shove your arguments up people's noses and down their throats, and they'd still be rejecting them.
No, just Southern Baptist.
Next question. Yeah. That would be you, Jonah. Did you hear that?
I did not, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, let me just do it in 2 parts. The first part was, it was the two cultures question, right? Do you find that there's a break between art and science, that the two sides have trouble understanding each other? Certainly, in your more recent writings, you've been sort of saying, look, everything belongs to me. Biology rules, and well, never mind. But I'll just ask Jonah's question. Do art and science are they having an honest and good conversation at the moment?
No, not really. But one is beginning to shape up. There's a whole generation of young scholars now in the social sciences and humanities, and in the sciences, biology particularly, evolutionary biology most particularly, who are beginning to see common ground. And this is the argument that I presented in the book Consilience. So in case you'd like to follow that argument, the argument is that the line that has been traditionally drawn between the great branches of learning, the natural sciences and the humanities and the humanistic social sciences is not a line. It's not a permanent fault. It is a large, unexplored area of phenomena, which biologists, through neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and cognitive psychology and so on, have just come up to the edge of. And from the social sciences, fields like anthropology, increasingly psychology, and even economics increasingly now, are beginning to come in from the other side. And the first bridges are being built. And they're shaky, they're uncertain. Biology is a main component, but biology is not the hegemonic discipline. There's going to be a whole, that will prevail. There will be a whole new area and whole new disciplines in this area built up. And I predict that, of course, others, say, no, this is impossible. There really is a epistemological chasm that will never be closed, different ways of thinking. And all these dreadful postmodernists would like to keep it that way because they don't want to learn biology. But the point is that I think that this is not only can be filled in as we go, but that it'll be one of the most exciting intellectual adventures in the history of humanity as it is filled in.
And the second part of the question, or did he handle it? He handled it? Yeah. Last question will be, I guess, yeah.
I wonder if you could comment a little bit about how we know the rates of extinction and how we can compare that to periods before people were around to observe it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I understood we weren't even quite sure how many species existed on Earth right now. So I'm trying to understand how we can calculate rates of extinction, and then sort of going back to fossil periods where we're looking at fossils, how are we able to make that calculation?
Question is, how do you know what the rate of extinction is when you don't know who's here? So you can't say goodbye to people you haven't said hello to, creatures.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I answered it in part. What I didn't say was that because most groups of organisms, including particularly the bacteria, and other microorganisms, are so poorly known that we really don't know much about the origin, the rate of origin, and the rate of extinction in them. So we have to depend on certain groups, we call them focal groups of organisms that we do know well. And these are the vertebrates, particularly the terrestrial vertebrates, birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles, that have been very well studied. And we know most of the species, and a great deal about many of the particular groups within them. And also, we know the flowering plants quite well. We now know about 280,000 species, and we're estimating maybe 320,000 are out there. So we're getting, pretty complete knowledge of the flowering plant. We know a lot about the butterflies and about dragonflies and about mollusks, especially, both terrestrial and aquatic freshwater mollusks. And from these groups, and from a knowledge of these groups, many of which are, very different from one another, ecologically and otherwise, we draw the estimates that I've just made. And as I mentioned earlier, there are three ways of estimating the rates of extinction, and or drop to near extreme critical level. One is by the area-species relation we discussed. The other is at the rate at which the species are passing through the red list. It's just the velocity that do it. The third is by a new field called population viability analysis, in which rare species are evaluated from all the aspects of biology that you can study. And how this affects the random fluctuations in their population. Not only their trends up or down, but the random changes in numbers that occur year by year, and from that you can make an estimate of how long they will last. So those three methods together being brought in concert to make the estimates that I gave earlier of about 1/10% order of magnitude per species per year going extinct or committed to early extinction.
Here, he'll be here. You can just come up here and you can ask him but I have to say goodnight because they're going to shut down the lights. I want to thank him for coming and you for coming, and thank you very, very, very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.